Hey, folks, and we're back for another episode of Plan A Conversations. I really hope you enjoyed last week's chat with Karen Parsons. And as you all have been asking me, you've been asking on all the different social media channels, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. You're very curious to continue part two of the conversation with Barbara Chen around reimagining purposeful policing. And after our first interview, I'm so glad that she's back with us, but it wasn't planned. I just felt instinctively that we needed to go ahead and have another part two because there's so much more to unpack. And in full disclosure, we are recording this on MLK Day. We're recording this 2 days before the inauguration. And so when this actually airs, it'll be the following Friday. And so anything that happens between there and then, just keep that in mind if we're not addressing some of those things, as I have Barbara back with me. First of all, Barbara, welcome back to the conversation. So good to see you again.
Hello, Clay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to ask you just out the gate, what was your sort of feedback? What are people saying, and what was your experience after the first interview? It'd be kind of great to maybe just jump into the conversation that way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have to say that to my great relief, the feedback I have gotten has been positive. But it is to say that they feel, and these are my friends,
Oh.
that I have something to contribute to this conversation. And I think I've always known that to be true, but I've always been very reluctant to join the chorus and the sound and fury. And I also think I just carried a lot of insecurity from having been a member of the police department, albeit a civilian, and being always very mindful of the enormity of the department, and not wanting to say something wrong, but also not wanting to, overstep whatever my professional boundaries may have been. So I think the feedback's been good, and so has, I think, my feeling about continuing this conversation with you.
Yeah, and the feedback that I've been receiving from multiple people has been, where has Barbara been all this time? Uh, I mean, really to amplify this voice, to amplify this work, because a lot of times, Barbara, I really think we have one perspective as people who are on the outside, and sometimes if you understand the inner workings of a system, you're able to sort of identify some of the isms a lot faster and be able to come up with solutions. So how are you balancing having that information, understanding what you know, and then also having to courageously, start speaking out and speaking up for what you feel is right?
It's a great question. I think, we all hear calls to action very differently. Mine has been a consistent presence, even after leaving the department. I think I have to say that having left the department and having the benefit of distance is a good thing, because I think had I tried to make some of these points or penetrate some of these debates earlier, I really would have been, I believe, seen too much as a mouthpiece of the department. I mean, again, to be clear, my job was in the public information division. My job was working as a liaison with the media. So I think that any number of critics and skeptics could have thought, well, this is a woman just sort of, doing what her work had been. But here's what's great about having left the department. Just on a personal level, I was able to experience completely different environments. I went from the police department to Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is, Mayor Bloomberg's foundation. And I worked specifically in the government innovation practice. And I worked on an ideas competition called the Mayor's Challenge, which is continuing, and this year will be global. The year that I did it was for European cities. And the Mayor's Challenge is all about surfacing and supporting good ideas for how to improve the quality of life in cities, and particularly with cities that have populations of 100,000 or above. So that was such useful education for me in seeing how programs can be tested implemented, improved, measured? How do you really define impact? Like, we all have
Yes.
intentions, and we all may think we have solutions. We may see shortcomings with some of those solutions. What do we do with that? So that was a real educational process that, was about 2 years that I spent with Bloomberg Philanthropies. And then I went to Columbia University, and this was before, it was fall of 2015. So we were now heading into the year that would lead up to the election of our now, so I want to say, thank God, outgoing president, Donald Trump. And that's this was the irony of going to Columbia University, right? This is like it's the Ivy League and this ivory tower. And yet it was very similar to me to working, not in the police department, but for the city. So Columbia, to give you one example, was founded by royal charter in 1754, which makes it almost 100 years older than the NYPD.
Wow.
And it is a lot. You have 18 different schools, undergraduate, graduate, 2 campuses, right? One, the medical center in Morningside Heights, and then the Morningside campus on 116th and Broadway. And so on one hand, it's sort of this rarefied institution. And, I went to State University in California, so this is not a familiar environment to me. But, on one hand, you have people who are just brimming with energy and intention and really pursuing their best, intellectually and otherwise. And then you have a lot of silos. You have
So
effectively
true.
18 different schools led by 18 different leaders. There's a central administration, for whom some would argue the head is really a fundraiser in chief, which is true for many
Yeah.
universities. And it was a different kind of challenge. Like, how do you create an environment? How do you foster a place where people can disagree, and bring to bear all of the intellectual resources that this university stands for, right? So you have these great scholars on constitutional law and public health, and how do we have these conversations? And as I say, I began the fall of 2015, and not long after we saw, there was Charleston, Ferguson, meaning I started not long after these events.
Right.
And then we had Charlottesville. And so the office for which I worked really tried to bring together university-wide forums. So not just student activists, not just scholars and academics, but everybody, right? And we would try to have these conversations, campus conversations, led by my former boss, the executive vice president of University Life, where we would try to bring different voices to the discussion, whether you were an artist, an activist, an advocate, an academic, and the students, and really sort of just encourage like a conversation about what the hell in some cases is happening, and what do we do with that? And where do we go from here? Which, because it's MLK Day, I have to say, required reading. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community? Yes. Dr. King. This is post Selma. And he's looking at where do we go from here. So those jobs, I think, while I was in them, and they were very busy, very demanding jobs, every time, and we mentioned this, you and I, I mentioned this in our last discussion, every time something would erupt in the news related to police or police brutality, I always felt this sadness, right? A sorrow, and for the aggrieved, and for the police, and for our inability to seem to bridge the divide. And I'll give you an example. So at Columbia, one of the conversations that I was describing was literally called, I think, Charleston, Ferguson, and beyond. Like, what do we do with this? And I remember in planning that discussion, there had been it's a campus, and everybody's using their smartphones, but we had a poster, like a movie-sized poster advertising the talk, and the poster depicted protesters. And somebody wrote to the office and said, I really think you need to think about what kind of message this poster or this, title
Really?
suggests. Yeah, and the backstory was, this was somebody who they were not, it wasn't that they were, it sounds critical, but what they were saying, and they identified themselves as being, I think, from a law enforcement family. It may even have been, it was a member of the university. It was, an employee of the university. And all that this person was saying was, there should be some aspect of like law enforcement and public safety, like we can't forget that perspective and that voice. So I brought this concern to the planning discussion, and it was heard, but I didn't really find a way to insert it, right? And that is sort of understandable too, because I think we had to recognize where we were. Like I thought about it, and in retrospect, it's like, had you put a police officer on that panel, or a voice representative of law enforcement, is it possible that in that conversation they would have been protested, that they would maybe not have had an opportunity to speak about all the complexities? Also, could you have put somebody in that seat, and could they even speak for law enforcement broadly? Like for example,
Right.
I have 7 years with one police department. And as I have said, it is a very unique police department. So I can't really talk to, many municipal law enforcement agencies across this country, meaning it's complicated. And so in any case, that kind of, I don't want to call it an imbalance, but I've always been aware that in these conversations, there is an aspect that is missing, and it's like, we need to talk about that. And that is very hard. Also, when people's urgency is high, and when emotions and tension is high, it's hard to say, when people are dying, and people are seen as people are being killed, and they're in the adjudication of these cases, in a lot of cases, there's no indictment. There may not even be a trial. There may not even be sentencing. So when we talk about the flaws in our system, it's understandable that people want to see something change, and change immediately. And there's, it's like, how do we sort of, okay, let's look at that whole picture. Like that, what I just described, that's not just the police. That's also the courts. That's prosecutors. That's the whole thing. And so, but you can't. Can you cover that in a single session? That's of a certain time and capacity and head occupancy limit. Not in the way that maybe you and I can, but you and I have years of having these conversations, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the question of the hour. Where does one begin? Because even as you're describing these conversations at Columbia, the fact that there was even resources available to create this platform, and resources available to have these kinds of talks at an institution like Columbia is a little bit more attractive, and rather than spaces where there aren't resources that are available.
That's
So
right.
where do we start? To begin, because another part B of that is there's so many of us who are looking on television and we're just saying, stop killing us, stop shooting us, stop, and you're right. There are conversations of things that need to happen. And it's kind of hard to see this full picture when it's happening to you,
Right.
and
Of
not
course.
through you. It's happening to you right now. So from your vantage point, where do we start?
I mean, we have to start, I think of one of my favorite pieces of scripture that I've truly discovered in the last 5 to 7 years since leaving the department is to always let your conversation be full of grace, but seasoned with salt, right? And I think of that also in relation to what you said on one of our on part one, Clay. You said or no, I'm sorry, this wasn't in our conversation, but it is one of your podcasts in which you said, we can have grace, but to have grace doesn't mean that we don't have consequences, right? I think is what you said,
Right. That's it.
Grace without repercussion. So I guess to answer the question, I think so many things. Like I don't have a perfect solution,
Right.
but we will talk about the project with which I'm involved that does bring together in a concentrated and very intentional way police and community members. And I think more of that is needed. And speaking to resources, Clay, yes, you're right. Where we need resources for so many things. We think about the defund movement. And I think, okay, I am down with the evaluation and reallocation of resources. I think defund is obviously provocative for a reason. I mean, look how...
And Barbara, can you explain what that is for our general audience who may have not heard that phrasing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the wake of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, which followed the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, many activists began calling for a defunding of the police. So, there are people who would call themselves abolitionists. Like this is sort of a not an outgrowth of, but like abolish ICE, defund the police, this kind of thing, like burn it down. Like we got to start over. And a lot of people reacted to that. And I think some of that reaction was also what you see in the exploitation of, the concept of law and order by certain politicians. But defund, when we really dissect it, there are people who absolutely believe that we should defund and do away with police. And as I said in part one, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it would be naive and wishful thinking to think that you're just going to do away with the police and come up with something else. Even if you came up with some other entity to protect and enforce public safety, you'd still run into the same problem. So anyway, so I hope I've explained what the defund the police movement is. But where was I going? Where was I going with that, Clay?
We're talking about resources being allocated.
Resources.
Yeah.
Well, let me say this. I feel it important to say that when I was in the police department, I did see resources allocated to communities of color for important and supportive conversations and programs, education, and intervention. I saw partnerships between Brooklyn clergy and the police in some of the city's most dangerous precincts. And I saw they measured, so after this coalition, which basically said to churches in Brooklyn and clergy leaders who were willing, we have a problem. We have high crime. We have high violent crime. What do we do about it, right? And this is like, what do we do together? And there were a number of interventions. I'm sure they're searchable, on old NYPD press release literature. But anyway, at the end of this first couple years, what the police and the clergy saw was a decline in violent crime. And, you can't say that it is directly related, but I think that's a conversation that needed to be had, right? So I think it gave, in some cases, people the opportunity to go to a church. And if they wanted to share that they'd been the victim of a crime, and then the church would work with the police. It was also very much about building trust. And not like descending on a place and saying like, I have a solution. It was very much about like, what is the community saying is lacking? Another conversation, it was called Grandmother's Love, LOV, Love Over Violence. And this was in recognition of the fact that many grandmothers were caring for children whose parents had been incarcerated or had died as a result of violence. And it was the police department finding ways to support these grandmothers. And, I would go to a breakfast in a church, and in the memory I have in Brooklyn, and it would be the police department having brought in a public health expert to support this this group of women who were raising adolescents and young adults to talk to them about, sexual health and other things, to ask them what they needed, and to again to gather and to and we're in a church, pray,
Right.
sing, be joyful about that which there was to be joyful about, and to really be in partnership and in conversation. And so those are programs that I remember now, like, oh, there were conversations happening. There were resources and energies being directed. Now, that doesn't eradicate some of the really awful things that happen between police and communities. But to answer your question about resources, it's like they have to be found, and there needs to be leadership that says, with what we have, what do we do? And if your question is about access, like who can join these conversations, I mean, I think we've seen so many conversations, good and bad, Clay, in this day and age, play out on social media, and those are not conversations, right? That is, those, they can be, but they don't tend to be of the meaningful depth and authenticity that I think you and I are trying to model and encourage and practice.
Yeah, and in part one of our conversation, Barbara, we talked about like a lot of our experiences of even just what you were sharing. There is not a model for it. There hasn't been an example for it. So I want to get into definitely the work that you're doing with the theater company in Brooklyn. But even with like defunding the police, one of the, I think, best sort of experiences of understanding that I've been able to sort of take from different activists is we're not saying, or they're not saying, we want to just abolish altogether. It's how do we train police officers to be able to de-escalate? How do we take some of those resources from police officers that really need to be for a mental health professional alongside the police officer to support, a stopping, or someone who's holding someone, for whatever reason. It just seems like they don't have the skill or the education or the background to have to take that burden on, as well as trying to protect, and serve at the same time.
I think that's a great example. And, you and I have a mutual friend who has a PhD in psychiatry and who works with the community in Upper Manhattan. And, we had this conversation in the summer about, finding ways to adequately adjust, but also respond to need. And, as an example, she gave me, there are often times when the police are needed for safe transport of an individual who may, need to go to, whether it's, probably to the hospital or somewhere. But maybe we don't need those officers to be the first line of response. And I think, yes, and our soon-to-be Vice President Kamala Harris writes in her book, The Truths We Hold. She talks about so many things related to mental health. The thing that I think is so important to remember that she clarified in her writing is there is a shortage of mental health expertise in this country. Okay, why is that? Not only why is that, but what do we do about it, right? How do we better structure our healthcare so that mental health experts are compensated, and so that people of any income level can access mental health support? But again, if we're looking at mental health relative to the quote unquote defund movement, there's an assumption there that there's an availability of experts who want to work in these environments of emergency response. In some part, like where you and I live, therapy is like getting a coffee, right? Or the way people talk about going to therapy. So it's don't
abundant.
have and we don't have a stigma, and it's it's well, I mean, some families and communities do, but My point is, it's more widely accepted and utilized. If you look at, and I learned this from Kamala Harris, if you look at like rural Alabama or other parts of this country, the availability of a mental health expert per, like 100 people is less than one. You know what I mean? Or less. It's like there are not enough people to go around.
Right.
There's that. So we have to think about that. I do think there have been, and I've read about these accounts. There is I'm forgetting the acronym, but there's an organization, I think it's in Oregon, that years ago, they basically started like a mental health caravan. And the idea was that they would alleviate the calls for police assistance or response related to mental health crises. And instead, they would deploy a community-driven mental health expert, a caravan. Yes, and that is in a city whose population is a fraction of what ours is, right? And
Right.
also,
Yeah.
and yes, I think that they one of the statistics, and I have this article somewhere. I think it's definitely in the CNN archives. They were able to they were able to respond to a number of mental health crises that would otherwise have been diverted, or not diverted, but received by the police. But it's also a question of what are the ways that we better train, as you said, or train officers to respond to these. One of the things that I did after leaving Columbia was work with a company that produced a virtual reality training funded by Axon. So Axon is the country's preeminent or taser manufacturer, and tasers being a less lethal option than a gun, but tasers also being overused. So Axon recognized that they needed to invest resources in training people about when maybe to not use your taser. Like, okay, you have a taser, maybe you shouldn't use it. So they produced a number of trainings. The first one was, how do you respond to a schizophrenic? And it was really high tech. I tried this on. You would sit, or the trainee would basically don a Google Glass, or one of these headsets, and in surround sound and cinematic vision, be in the scene, responding to a call where a mother's adult son, is having a schizophrenic episode, and they come on the scene, and they basically it's like a choose your own adventure. They're taken through options. Okay. So they get there, the individual who's going through an episode is outside of the home and has a screwdriver, and it basically prompts the trainee, what do you do? Do you, and I'm exaggerating here, but do you tackle him? Do you call for backup? What do you do? And the point was also to say, okay, let's recognize after these options, they would then show them, and these trainings were produced in concert with mental health experts. So there were things like, okay, turn off your lights. Flashing, blinding lights is agitating to us. It's especially agitating to somebody going through mental health crisis.
Right.
Is this person, are they off their medication, or do they take, just gathering information, and also finding a way to respond that doesn't result in the use of a taser or other physical force. Now, here's the trick, Clay. This was a beautifully produced training, but how many, and I sat with a very well-respected and senior retired, head of the New York State Division of Criminal Justice. And we put this headset on him, and we showed him, this is the training that is being produced to show officers how to deal with somebody who is suicidal. This is the training being produced that takes officers through responding to somebody who's been accused of robbing a store, but really is autistic. He puts it on. He's like, okay, this is right. But here's the hurdle. this equipment is expensive. Okay.
Yeah.
What police department can afford to outfit its officers with Google Glass? And even if you said, okay, let's share the Google Glass and you rotate them through, that may be possible. And maybe you could pilot that in a department where there are 60 officers. But it's really hard to do that in a larger city, right, with many more officers. So that was one intervention that I was a part of. And the promising thing about that was you had, okay, so your question again, the resources, Axon outfits probably the majority of this country's police departments. I'm assuming, that there's a lot of revenue involved in that.
Of course.
They were committing money to this training. There had to be a will. They enlisted subject matter experts. The head of education, I think, she'd come from the private sector or maybe Silicon Valley. And so, she put in all the tech expertise.
Right.
But how do you get to adoption and implementation? It's not to say we have to abandon these efforts, but we have to recognize that it's just not like that. It's not that simple.
Especially when our money allocation for the things that seem to really matter, that we really should be focusing in on, we don't seem to be focusing in on, just across the board as a country. And I'm thinking about Tisha James' lawsuit against the NYPD. She's the AG attorney here, and literally just the response from the Black Lives Matter movement and the protesters here in New York City during the summer. And, she's come out and say, and you probably are hearing the police siren.
That's not timed.
In the background. Not at all. But literally, people are saying it's here, it's happening, and where are the resources then to be in place to really support those things, which to me, I would love to just even segue into the work that you're doing with a theater company. Because I imagine too, just even our brief offline conversations, if there was a massive amount of money put into some of these conversational pieces, it really could be massive in supporting and healing our work, especially through the police department. Go ahead and share with our audience what that is and what you've been up to.
Thank you for the opportunity. I mean, let me just say, I spent 2020, before the uprising, seeking federal funding. And it is not for
this project.
For this project. And it is not for the faint of heart. So nonprofits in general, right? I think one of the grievances, and I hear this, I was on I think that it was a community-centric fundraising sort of moral support call for fundraisers of color. And, one of the things somebody said on this call was, okay, it's so bad that we have to fight things like poverty and food insecurity, so on and so forth. So it's let me just say, again, the money is out there, but and I know now from experience, it's me and the director of development and the executive director of this nonprofit. And I'm, a part-time consultant, trying to find the money. It seems like it is abundantly available because now post the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, you have, the owners of the Brooklyn Nets committing $10 million to communities of color and to anti-racist programs. And hallelujah for that. But let me just say, to get at some of the funding that's available, you could go down rabbit holes looking and applying. I mean, just the application for one of the Department of Justice grants that we applied for last year. I mean, we worked for weeks, months, and wrote, this long paper, and at the end of the day, we did not get the grant, and no New York organization, may I add, got any grant from this last administration. And but it did fund things like, cops playing baseball with kids, which again, I'm not going to poop on anybody's efforts, but we have to look at what depth. And the point is, like, this program goes deep, but it doesn't go broad. It goes deep in that it gets you and me to spend 10 weeks together, during which time you cannot help but not begin to see the other person, if you were opposed, differently.
Are these volunteers? Like, how does that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So it's and I'm sorry, I'm rambling all over the place because
No,
I got
this
off
is
on my
good.
funding tangent.
This is great, Barbara.
But yes and no. By the way, if anyone wants to, the website is irondale.org, and the program is called To Protect, Serve, and Understand. And you can contact me if you're interested, but this is the idea. We want police officers, yes. We don't necessarily want the community affairs officers. We would rather the officers who a little rough around the edges, maybe
What do you mean?
Meaning you may even have had a discourtesy complaint. We want participants who stand to gain the most. And this is on both sides, community and police. So, for example, here's what I'm getting at. Like, if you bring everybody into the room and everybody's already like kumbaya, then there isn't really growth, right? It's really actually when we work with a range of attitudes and perspectives on both the officer and the civilian side that the greatest change occurs.
So getting to the disease and not the symptom.
Yeah, well, and also getting at like what again, I don't want to poop on anybody else's program, but there are look, this has been happening, and this being, excessive police violence or police brutality, or and certainly any number of injustices involving or not involving the police. This goes back. This predates you and me. This predates this program. The point is, you've got to bring in people who don't see that. They need to learn a little bit. And also, we don't want you don't want a self-selecting group, right? You don't want somebody who comes in and is like, I would never dismiss somebody who said they appreciated police, but you want somebody who comes in and says, I don't understand why we need to have police in schools, or why police in schools, need to carry on a certain way, right? And then there's just a small opportunity for maybe and I'm making this all up, but maybe the youth officer to say, I would like not to be in the school, or I would love if I wasn't the person called to respond to, a disturbance, or, X, Y, and Z. I mean, I think, if only the opportunity to hear from somebody you've never talked, the likes of which you've never talked to. Many of the people who come to this program, it's the first time they've even had a conversation with the police officer. And many of the police who come to this program initially thought it would be police bashing, right? And what happens is, you and I, unlike what happens on social media, I'm going to sit with you. Every week of this program begins with a communal meal. So there, it's just like a breaking of bread, a breaking of the ice. You can't like name call somebody and then walk away the way you can on social media. You can't just like make your speech and not have to answer questions in response to your speech. And besides that, it's not just like a forum for discussion, but people are led through these scaffolded exercises that really will teach you how to listen more critically and to solve problems, and to be creative together. So, and I'm not the artist facilitator. I'm not a theater person, but I have seen and I have heard police and community members talk about how this changes their perspective, similar to the way maybe some of the people who listened or are listening just didn't think about. Oh, I didn't think about that before, And
Right.
it sounds almost. I mean, I don't know if it sounds obvious, but like the idea that officers and community members, both at the end of the day, like one exchange that our executive director gives as an example, is two women. And I think this is actually an audience member. So at the conclusion of this workshop, there's a public performance, and
Oh, wow.
family, friends, colleagues come to this performance, and then there's a facilitated Q&A. So all of these themes that come up during the workshop are acted out in monologues. So let's pretend you're an officer. I play you, right? Which requires me to really think about and try to embody your experience, and vice versa. It's just, it's just a little bit of a head game, but it's like, even if you were totally against whatever you had to say, I'm going to speak your words.
Right.
I'm going to think about what they mean. And anyway, this audience member, I think, was just trying to make the point that, at the end of the day, I want my child to come home, and I see you, the officer, as a threat, as a reason that he might not. And the officer said something like, and at the end of the day, I want to go home to my kids. And it wasn't all as simple as that, but it was basically like, here were two mothers now exchanging something that they've felt in common. And once we realize our shared humanity, maybe we can start to defang, and we can talk more honestly, and we can get into history, and we can get into some solutions. The idea that I hope comes to fruition is that it won't only make people feel better. This is it, and this is not therapy. This is not just like, let's all feel good, but it's
Right.
also like, what do we do with this? So one of the things that we are proposing in our pursuit of grants and support is that, over time, we would be able to see, like, did participants in this program continue the conversation, and did they become, did they start going to, I don't know, their precinct community council meetings? Did the officers involved succeed in their careers? Were they promoted? Was there a ripple effect? Were they able to model this better listening and interpersonal communication for their colleagues? We believe that, but we'd like to be able to see that, and to be able to measure that also requires, some access to the police department and to its records, and a willingness. I think there may be some leaders out there who are open to that, but the particulars, have to be worked out.
I mean, and that is just such a brilliant reasoning. It's a brilliant purpose and meaningful statement. I think so many times people don't want to be proven wrong. Like, they don't want to be the wrong person and on the wrong side, if you will, of history.
Yeah.
And I think people miss the point that someone is just trying to share their experience. And when you can share your experience, you're able to hear and say, oh, that's maybe not my intention on what is happening. But if you're experiencing me like that,
That's
here's a
right.
question of how can I then be be in better understanding of my actions,
Right.
and then my thought process behind it, and
Yeah.
conversation.
Well, see,
It
and
teaches
Clay,
us.
you're a communicator, so you get this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think what we don't realize, and I'm not saying this excuses any misconduct, abuse, or violence, but I think what we don't realize is that police training is largely tactical.
Right.
That is a paramilitaristic environment. And, I've spent some time at the police academy as an observer, not as a trainee. And it is like the military. And I often used to think like, well, this is interesting. You basically, and I'm not incriminating anybody here, but like you take recruits and train them for 6 months, and sometimes maybe they're just like barked at, and then you send them out onto patrol and expect them to have a customer service attitude. Maybe we need to train in customer service,
And yeah,
and in the tactical. I
right.
mean, believe me when I say I am haunted by a lot of accounts of violent crime that does happen. And I have been to hospitals where police have been shot and killed. I have, and I have had conversations with my friends who say, yes, and that doesn't equate. You know what I mean? Like, taking away nothing from that particular case, we still have a big problem here. Yes. But I think we have to look at the problem with some specificity, right? And it's like, okay, along with the tactical training, what other knowledge needs to be developed? And, there's a lot of discussion about implicit bias. There are a lot of consultants who make a lot of money training on implicit bias. But I would say, okay, what do you do with that? Because Clay, everybody, like, part of what the original scholars who proved implicit bias proved is that everybody has it. It's more like, what does implicit bias in policing mean? If we assume that is there, isn't it also possible that the police can be trained not to act on implicit bias? Like, what are the different, there's also discretion, like, just because I see, like, just as I, as a resident of my neighborhood, can see somebody on my street who I do not know, I can check myself. I'm not under threat or under siege. I'm not, sworn to protect others. I don't have in my mind all of the possible scenarios. But my point is, like, I can choose not to treat that person the way I've seen some people treat that person, with suspicion, with disdain. I can choose to watch and listen before I make any kind of contact, right? And I think that is something that's also true. I mean, I've talked to police commanders who they're like, oh yeah, we've been to implicit bias training. You spend a day, maybe half a day, and you basically learn that we all have these internalized biases.
That's right.
Okay, but what do you do with that, right?
Yeah.
And there is a lot of money. Let's talk about resources. I read one account that was like a multi-million-dollar contract for this consultant to train police. And again, it's like, okay, what if we, and I know people will say, well, what about using that money for youth programs, community centers? Yes, yes, yes. But also, how do we, we can't do both all the time, but sometimes maybe we make some adjustments and it's a little bit here and a little bit there. I mean, you brought up, and I don't know the particulars, but you brought up the suit by the Attorney General. And a question I have, right? It's like, and people have raised this, it's like, how much money is spent in civil settlements after cases of police brutality where there's not a criminal outcome and then it goes to a civil suit, right? Okay. Also, all of the attention and the energy spent, on this case, it's like, I would love if we could spend some of that same scrutiny and energy on looking at training. And as I said in part one, looking at hiring, looking at recruitment, because it's all of it. And there's no easy answer to any one part of it.
Yeah. And I could talk to you all all day, Barbara, about this. I mean, because I think you're really doing some really interesting work and needed and impactful work. And just in terms before I let you go, of this being very difficult work and the stretching of that, how have you been sort of just stretched spiritually, emotionally, mentally, within this? Like, what have you learned about yourself throughout this process? Because I can't not imagine you doing this kind of work and not having reflective time as well to support that.
Thank you for the question. And I apologize for my long-windedness because we have like 10 minutes.
No,
But
it's totally fine.
um, well, let me just say, I think, and I actually reflected on this after part one of our conversation, Clay. I realized that faith for me was an off ramp, right? A lot of times we think of faith as an on ramp, to peace and to relief. But here's how my faith was an off ramp. So, like, if the highway of these issues and that job is like a bunch of cars speeding, and it's like the media, it's the police did something, it's a horrible knife point rape that I can't get out of my head, all these things, right? It's grief, it's mourning. Faith gave me an off ramp from that highway of all of those things, and gave me a place to go and to seek. And I don't know, seek what. Like, I think I know that I spent a lot of time in prayer asking for protection of the city's police, and also that they would have judgment and wisdom, that they would be used in the best way where they were most needed. It's like that gave me relief. So did Scotch. sometimes 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 just I would come home from the hospital, and we would have had a press conference after a case where an officer was shot within centimeters of a main artery, but he lived and the perpetrator also lived. And you'd be running on like no food, and it would already be too late to go to bed before. I mean, you weren't going to get a lot of sleep, but you were so wound up. And I think sometimes, just having a moment. And
Right.
if I didn't have my faith, I'm not really sure. I don't know. Like, I think people find relief in a lot of different ways.
Right.
And also when I didn't feel any solution, when I felt despair, that it is then that I could turn to my friends of faith, that I could go to church, that I could, thumb my Bible, like get back to quiet time. And I don't want to say that there are any convenient salves. But there is a lot of justice and mercy and promises for how the oppressed will be dealt with in the Bible. There is a lot of guidance, just as I shared, from Colossians, the grace and salt, and for some people that's not enough, but it helped me.
Yeah. How do you define your purpose and call in the world, especially now?
Oh gosh.
What does that feel like, I guess?
Well, it's funny. Again, because of part one of our conversation, I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I went back in my journal, and I read, like, a year ago, I was like looking at all the things I'd done in the decade leading up to 2020. And then I made this short list of what I wanted to do in the next decade. And number 4, I don't know why number 4, I need to go back and see what 1 through 3 were, but like number 4 was like bridge divides, like find a way to bridge divides. And so that's definitely a big part of my work. And a friend asked me this, and I think the response I gave her, and it was more in the context of like, as a communicator, as a marketer,
Hmm.
I realized like, I am a mission driven multidisciplinarian. So if it means that it's in conversation like this, that
Hmm.
we probe at and discover some truths, or community of support, a coalition of conscience, to
Mm,
to invoke Dr.
that
King,
part.
then so be it. I'm still figuring it out.
Yeah.
I am grateful for your welcoming me to sort of talk about it, because I'm still figuring it out. And I don't know if it's going to be through writing,
Hmm.
or through doing more like this, but I do know that whatever it is, I will continue to do the work I'm doing with Irondale on their To Protect, Serve, and Understand program. And I'd worked with a couple other police related nonprofits, and have since stepped away from those to spend more of my focus on this one. But I'm always going to be looking. I got a whole spreadsheet of organizations, not all of whom I would want my help, but
Yeah.
there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, and I respect that immensely. Before I let you go, Barbara, let's do a little plan A to plan A and just go ahead and complete whatever the sentence, the phrasing is after I repeat it. The world needs more of. Is that the answer?
What the world needs now. I mean, healing,
Mm,
but resilience, um, acceptance,
mm. I am most
perseverance.
perseverance, all that, right? I am most challenged by in this moment.
Mm. Um, the enormity of the task, and also my own self doubt.
Okay. Okay.
Fear of saying the wrong thing. Like,
Yeah.
and that's when you have to return to like, well, I know what I'm trying to do.
Hmm.
I know who I am trying, what that I'm trying to reduce harm.
Hmm.
But, we live in an era of a lot of shouting and,
Hmm.
you know, cancel culture, and those, as much as I would like to be someone who's not um, cowed by those things, I have
Of
been this
course.
year. I've been worried
Yeah.
about stuff like that.
Yeah. I am at peace mostly when.
On my yoga mat. Of late, it's been writing. I have a devotional for writers called Pray, Hear, Write,
Mhm.
and it's by an editor and woman of color in Florida, and she's written and edited and published secular work, for the secular world as well as the faith world. And it's this very, I mean, each devotional is about a page and a quarter, and she really guides me to remember that it is not my words, but his wisdom. It's like I can come to this work and say, let whatever gift I might have, please let it be used in the way that God sees fit. And let me trust that that will happen.
Mhm. Let me trust that that will happen. Last but not least, my prayer request that I ask others for me is
Oh, for me.
for you.
Oh, gosh. That is a really generous question.
Let this
Um,
global audience support you in that.
Thank you.
What,
Thank you,
how
audience.
can we, yeah,
um,
yeah, what's your
Maybe
prayer?
pray that I would develop whatever part of my story resonated most with you, that I would find place and opportunity to share it and to share it well.
Okay. Barbara Chen, where can we learn more again about the organization? And also, if people want to offer monetary support, where can we do that, or how can we do that and support you?
Oh, thank you so much, Clay,
Yeah.
for asking. So the organization is Irondale Ensemble Project, and their website is irondale.org. That's, iron, IRONDALE.org. And you'll see there on the website both a donate
Mhm.
area as well as an area that talks about this program, which is to protect, serve, and understand. And of course, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn, and I think that might even be in the description if you're looking at this on YouTube. And I'd love to hear from you.
Barbara, thank you so much for part one, part two. I know there'll be part 3 and 4 after some interesting creative ideas that I think is forthcoming actually, makes its way into the world. But as your friend, as somebody who's watched you, just for lack of better words, glow up, in this and mature within yourself for this work, I'm so proud of you because there's so many people who are talking about the problems, talking about the rhetoric, about what it could be. And you're actually in the thick of things doing some of the messy, messy, messy work
We
that
are
a lot of
trying. We are
yeah.
trying.
Yeah. And that's what's really important. So listen, folks, of course, I'm going to have all of Barbara's contact information at the base of this podcast where you can learn more about her. Please connect with her. Fund this really interesting project that she's working on. And also just be in contact with the organization as well. That email address and website will also be at the base of the podcast. I want to thank Barbara again for this conversation. Folks, listen.
Thank you.
No, this isn't easy work. It's hard. It's messy. It's complicated. But I think the great part about all this is just knowing that we are in the arena. We're in the boxing rink. We're in the actual field space, working to figure out a solution together. Again, you can learn more about me by visiting clayswilliams.com, and I'm on all of your favorite social media by the handle of @PlanA with Clay. Folks, Clay's with a K. Don't forget. Look forward to seeing you in the very next episode of Plan A Conversation. Peace.